Warning, what you are about to hear is born of long years of deep friendship, shared experience, brutal honesty, and the reconciling grace of Jesus Christ. Please, do not walk up to the first black or white person you know and start this sort of banter. It will not end well.
What I would love to hear you talk on for our audience, because we're in a mainline space, we're in a mainline Christian space, and a lot of people are often fascinated by your work in terms of how it appeals to evangelicals and what it says about the evangelical tradition. And I feel that that is the greatest white supremacist trope, right? That it's over there. The problem is over there. And we leave this piece. It's like we let mainline Christians off the hook. And so I'm wondering, when we talk about, you know, being white too long, what would you say is the single greatest thing to undo that reality?
All right, you want me to jump in here?
Yeah,
Yeah.
go
So
for it.
you're gonna start with something small.
Yeah. Oh yeah. That's what we do here. We just tackle easy things.
Yeah. So a couple of things that as you've been talking that really resonated with me, and I'm going to get to that point, but I want to set the table a little bit. You know, I began the book with a chapter called "Seeing," right? Seeing, because I think that even from that opening description of you entering this white Christian world and feeling the dissonance, right, as an African American walking onto that campus, right, in a way that nearly all the white students did not on that campus, right. And I think that in itself is telling, right, of kind of where we are, that there was this whole realm of white assumptions that just in the ether, right, in these white Christian spaces, right, and if you're white and you grew up in them, it's like a fish in water, right? I mean, you are swimming around in it. It's something that's fairly invisible, and partially that's because it's about a power structure that supports you if you're white, right? So it feels fairly comfortable. You benefit from it, and so the incentives, for looking at it differently, deconstructing it, are not high. If you're white, because you benefit, right, from those things. But I think we've got to see it. We've got to see this edifice that has been built over hundreds of years, right? Built into our theology, built into our liturgy, built into the way we read the Bible, how we even think about the Bible. I mean, it goes all the way down. And so I think, what you said, I don't horrifying, disturbing, this thing that maybe the best thing for America is the de-Christianization of white folks. There's a way in which you can read the data, and it certainly looks that way, right? So, for example, I mean, in contemporary public opinion data today, if you take your average white person and you add Christianity, they become more racist, right? They become less likely to be able to see systemic racism around them, or even to even deny it and deny its existence. So I think there's a couple of ways to think about that, right? So you could say, well, it's a de-Christianization, and might be true for the version of Christianity most white folks have, right? That we're talking about a deep deconstruction, here, that needs to happen. And I give this example sometimes. So in 2011, I had a bout with colon cancer. And, as a result of that, I faced in my early 40s, having to go through a pretty gnarly round of chemotherapy, right? 8 rounds of chemotherapy. And, that experience, right, you often feel like, okay, the treatment is going to kill me. It's worse than the disease, but what you're holding out at the end is that if I can do this work that is killing these cells, right, that ultimately are going to kill me if I don't kill them first. You do the work, because at the end of the thing is health.
Amen.
right? And I feel like that's where we are with white Christianity, right? We have so allowed white supremacy to metastasize in our ranks, right? It's a cancer on the church, but it is so widespread at this point that we're going to need something, the kind of metaphorical equivalent of a kind of broad chemotherapy to kill these cells that are everywhere, right? If we're going to have the hope of health and life on the other side, and if we don't do that, we're on a course to the grave, right? And even if the buildings are still standing and there's people in those buildings, we won't be doing the work of Christianity, in those spaces. We'll be doing something quite else than that. And I think that's the real danger of where we are. I mean, another way to kind of say this is that, we have. I mean, I often have thought it while I was writing this book. I mean, these, the Amazing Grace lyrics. I once was lost, now I'm found. I mean, white Christians like to sing that song as if they're on the found side of that lyric, right? But I think what the data suggests is that we're on the lost side of that lyric, and the sooner we figure that out and have the humility to realize just how much we've let white supremacy seep into our spaces and drive the kind of contemporary trends in white Christianity, the better off we're going to be. And again, it's not just because we need to set things right with our African-American brothers and sisters. We certainly need to do that. But I think what most white Christians haven't realized is that this is a struggle of life and death for ourselves, right? For our churches, for our health. This is about us and how we've warped our own sense of reality, our own sense of faith. I'll close with this. I also, going back and reading a kind of overlooked passage, I think, from H. Richard Niebuhr. Since we're in a mainline space, I'll cite a kind of big stalwart theologian inside white mainline Protestantism here for kind of do some work. But Niebuhr wrote this book called The Meaning of Revelation. And in that book, he talks about, it's kind of an overlooked piece of his theology. He talks about, that the church has its own kind of internal story that it tells about itself. But there's also an external witness from the outside world that tells a story about who the church is, right? And in that book, he says, look, I mean, certainly in all the church work we do, and we get some sense of God's ongoing revelation inside of that work that the church does, but we also have to pay attention to this external witness. And one of the reasons why I start with, the epigraph of the book is this citations from James Baldwin, which is where the title comes from, right? That where he's writing really in despair after the assassination of Martin Luther King, and he says, I'm going to paraphrase it here, but basically says, the great overwhelming majority of America's white population impresses me as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may so put it, too long. They've been married to the lie of white supremacy too long, right? And I think that witness, right, coming from outside the white church, holding up a mirror to what we look like, we white Christians look like from the outside, from our actions, from our words, is something I think we've never really taken seriously. I think I'm hoping that this moment of reckoning that we're in around racial justice is a time where the white church will not look away, right? But it'll kind of hold the gaze long enough to convince us that we've got to do some drastic things, not just to set things right with others, but to save ourselves. I mean, it really is about salvation at the end of the day.
Wow. Amen. Ooh, so much in what you just said. Some of it very encouraging. Thank you for some of my own work. I feel like you do this work at a real macro level, and I came to it from a kind of a micro space. So it's wonderful to hear the kind of interaction of the ideas of humility, as part of this. And so I really want to get to what this might look like, and what you see as what the chemo treatment might actually be. And my own family has been touched by colon cancer, so blessings to you. Wow.
I give thanks for that redemptive example that the Lord blessed you to recover in such a way, and to see the recovery in a way to use it for the life of the world. Thanks be to God.
Now, before we get to the action piece, the incarnational piece of this, if you will, I'm curious, because this is a conversation that Jabril and I have a lot. Anytime in white church history, and arguably maybe even white history, right? Like anytime we've trusted in white self-interest, things have gone pretty well awry, right? White self-interest has been interpreted in incredibly violent, capitalistic, suppressive, oppressive ways all the way through, right? Like, and so I'm skeptical, again, even in my own work, as we kind of process through this, of right, like saying, if we, the white church, figure out what and are driven by our own needs, our own desires, our own self-interest, that this time it'll be different for Black people when we're operating on white self-interest. And I'm curious sort of how you see or engage that, what I think of as a real tension in our history.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the longer, I'm just going to read it, actually. I'm going to read the longer quote from Baldwin here. So I'm going to break out Brother Baldwin. And I should say this too, one thing as a kind of white Christian, I grew up, Southern Baptist in the Deep South, went to Southern Baptist Seminary, where, I mean, if you think that the winds of kind of whiteness and white supremacy were blowing very hard at Virginia Theological, you can imagine what they were like, in an almost all male too, all white, almost all male seminary setting in Middle Texas. So anyway, but I'm gonna read the whole thing because I think he gets at this. So here's the longer quote that I got mostly right, it looks like. So again, he's writing after the assassination of Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy, and he's writing at a moment of despair because he I think kept holding out hope that white people and white Christians in particular would finally stand up, right, on the right side of the civil rights movement. And as King is mowed down and Bobby Kennedy's mowed down, and there isn't this great uprising by white Christian churches, right, to stand up in the wake of that kind of violence and atrocity, I think that's the moment, this kind of dark moment he's writing in. He says this. This is from a New York Times op-ed they wrote just a few months after the assassination. I will flatly say that the bulk of this country's white population impresses me, and has so impressed me for a very long time, as being beyond any conceivable hope of moral rehabilitation. They have been white, if I may put it, too long. They have been married to the lie of white supremacy too long. The effect on their personalities, their lives, their grasp of reality has been as devastating as the lava which so memorably immobilized the citizens of Pompeii. They are unable to conceive that their version of reality, which they want me to accept, is an insult to my history and a parody of theirs and an intolerable violation of myself. Right? Now, in some ways, like I feel like this whole book was a white guy from Mississippi, a white Christian guy from Mississippi trying to respond to that indictment. Right. But what's here, right, is he's not calling out just the external injustices, right? He's calling out like that we haven't seen what it's done, the effect on our personalities, on our lives, our grasp of reality, right? I mean, that we have warped like our entire sense of what's real and what's not, right? And I think in some ways we're seeing this play out today, right? So why do we have so many white Christians so ready to believe conspiracy theories, QAnon, whether it's about the vaccine or whether it's about the election, things that are so easily refutably false, right? And I think part of it is like if your bedrock conviction, right, is that this country was created to be a white Anglo-Saxon Protestant country. That is the bedrock of your belief system. Then you've kind of got two choices in the face of a changing demographics in this country. You can either face facts, which is going to require a lot of deconstruction of your worldview and a lot of dissonance and a lot of discomfort, or you could spin out fantasy after fantasy to kind of uphold this thing that is so clearly not true, right? But the cost of doing that is our own grasp of reality. Like we're literally, I mean, Baldwin actually described whiteness and the way it warps white as a kind of form of madness, right? That we've really embraced irreality, a way of being less than human, really. And I think that's the thing we've got to make sure people see is at stake, right? That's what's at stake. And I think, as we said earlier, like it for me, I think the big pull is when I look at my kids, right? Like, what do I want to hand down to my kids? Do I want to hand down, a deformed, distorted version of the faith and even reality to them? Like, no. Like, I think the job of each generation, right, and for parents, right, is you try to hand down the best things you can. You protect your kids from things that are going to ultimately harm them, right? And a white supremacist worldview built on the lie that white lives are worth more than others, right, ultimately harms everybody. And I think we've kind of got to wrap our heads around that.
We definitely have to wrap our heads around that. The question I have, and this is like asking this question helps my search, right? Because I tell people I do anti-white supremacy work. I don't do anti-racism work because I don't think racism is the problem. I think white supremacy is the problem. There's a lot of non-racists who are white supremacists.
There were a lot of abolitionists who were white supremacists. I mean, that's the thing. I think I don't think I was clear on that before I started doing the research for this book, but this just, if I can just jump in real quick, this example of Charles Finney, right, who was a renowned abolitionist, Presbyterian minister. But after the Civil War, one of his younger proteges who had, was very zealous and enthusiastic about the abolitionist work, was starting to organize an integrated worship service. And Finney stopped him in his tracks and said, "Oh, no, you err in supposing that the principles of abolitionism and amalgamation are the same, and they are not." Right. And I think the way that white supremacy so easily lived, even after the abolition of slavery, and lived in abolitionist circles, right? That those people who were many, if not most of those folks who were against slavery as such, were nowhere near seeing a commitment to social equality and living side by side between African Americans and whites on equal terms. I mean, that wasn't in the recipe of abolitionism for most.
Right, right. And that I mean, I appreciate that making the point plain, right? Like, because that's the issue when you talk about, okay, we got to wrap our heads around this. That segues perfectly into the question, right? Like, we have never seen white power, white Christians wrap their heads around that reality. There has always been some mitigating factor. There has always been something more important. If we look at the history of America, it's the history of kicking this can down the road, right? Like, the framers did it. They kicked the can down the road. After the Civil War, they did it. They kicked the can down the road. In the Civil Rights era, they did it. Kicked the can down the road. We continue to kick the can down the road. And I think it kind of lines up in this question here, right? Like, as we're looking now in the wake of the insurrection, and Congress is talking about what to do. It's interesting. they knew what to do with Nat Turner and with John Brown. Not that I'm advocating for a death penalty, right? But I'm saying when we look at white supremacy, we understood what to do when the insurrection was for the mattering of black life.
Mm.
But when the insurrection is about white grievances, we don't know what to do anymore.
And we even know what to do before. We even know what to do before the insurrection in favor of black life. But proceed. Sorry.
So when we talk about wrapping our heads around this stuff, how do we? Because here's the thing. We're going to investigate what happens. That's what they're calling for. They're going to investigate what happens. We're going to smack a black face on the investigation. A great guy, General Henry. Great guy. Phenomenal lineage, pedigree, so on and so forth. But I'm saying we're going to smack a black face on the investigation so that everybody is happy. It's a black face. We've investigated it. It's a 9/11 style commission. And we've said what failures happened in the system that let this happen. But I would argue that doesn't get anywhere close to how we got here. And I think that your work would argue we haven't gotten it. Whatever investigation they do in Congress will never get anywhere close to the reality of how we got here. So my question would be, what do you think is the white church's responsibility in the wake of this insurrection, using the data that you've researched, you know?
Well, I wrote a piece the day after at Religion News Service, and the title of the piece was called "Taking the White Christian Nationalist Symbols at the U.S. Capitol Riot Seriously."
Okay.
And so I think the first thing to do is that we've got to pay attention, right? It wasn't just yes, I mean there were these white supremacist group, Proud Boys and others that were there in force. Anti-Semitic groups were there in force, and with it was like one guy wearing a Camp Auschwitz hoodie, there plenty of all of that, Confederate flags everywhere that everybody saw. That got all the attention, right? But what got less attention was all the crosses, all the Bibles. There was actually the Christian flag.
They went into the chamber and prayed.
Yeah, went in the chamber and prayed and marched the Christian flag in with the Confederate flag into the chamber, the breached chamber, right? And that's on video. And what all the attention got was the Confederate flag, but nobody paid that much attention to that white Christian flag, right? It's a white banner. Shouldn't be lost on that. It looks a lot like the stainless banner, which was one of the Confederate flags that nobody knows that much about, but it was an all white flag. And so, but the official Christian flag, this was adopted by the Federal Council of Churches in 1942, and by the National Council of Churches. So again, these are mainline spaces that adopted this flag. It's a white flag with a blue canton in the center or in the corner and a red Latin cross, right? And inside that blue canton, but that was marched into that chamber. And this is the flag that many mainline, even I remember the church I grew up in, there were two flags up behind the pulpit. One was the American flag and one was the Christian flag, right? Those two flags were up there. In Vacation Bible School, we said the Pledge of Allegiance to the American flag. We said the Pledge of Allegiance to the Christian flag. And also in our Southern Baptist Church, we said the Pledge of Allegiance to the Bible. So we had those three things going on in Vacation Bible School, but that flag, right, was marched in. And I think we can't skip over that, right? It's not a coincidence, right, that the same people carrying the Confederate flags and the white supremacist symbols, that there was no dissonance. There weren't big fights breaking out between the people carrying the Christian flags and the Confederate flags. They were all storming the Capitol together, right? So that they were all on the same team. And I think that's I think the powerful thing about that is that puts in very contemporary, right in front of us on national television terms, what has been hidden, I think, in a lot of our history. And that is that those Confederate flags and those Christian flags have always marched together. Right. And we saw it and we tend to think about that as, something way, way back there. We saw it in 2021. in service of violence and in service of an insurrection, trying to overthrow a democratic election.
So how do we get white Christians to pay that attention? I know that's the $1 million question, right? If you could figure that out, funding would go through the roof, like, because that is the $1 million question right there. But really, like, because mainline churches are good for this, right? Episcopal Church is great for this, right? We'll call somebody like you in. We'll listen to you talk and do a session, and we'll ask you engaging questions, and we'll be, oh my God, we'll get your book, and we'll have you sign it, and we'll read it, and we'll talk about how much we read it. How do we get, like, what is the in your mind's eye, in your heart, what would be the praiseworthy response that you would wish to see from folk reading your book?
Yeah. So last night I did a session with First Baptist Church of Christ in Macon, right? It's actually one of two churches that I dedicate the book to. So there are these two First Baptist churches in Macon. One's predominantly white, one's predominantly African American, and they have this very challenging history that they used to be the same church in 1820 when it was founded, right? And it was white people bringing enslaved people to church with them. Like, that was the original setup of the church, and the church eventually split. Right as things were heating up before the Civil War, they split. The African American church eventually gets its own independence from the predominantly white church. And then they kind of ignored each other for about 150 years, right? Sitting literally, you could see the two steeples from one street corner, and they are literally around the corner from each other, and had no connection at all, right? Through and you know why, right? So because that era, right, that post-Civil War era was when the people in that white church were all about setting up and supporting the erection of Jim Crow and segregation, right, and denying the rights of those people around the corner. And so, what would they have to say to one another, right, when that project was going on? And finally, it was really only in 2014 that the two pastors finally got together and just said, like, what are we doing here? Like, we have this history. We're in the same community. We're literally around the corner from each other. And they started a process of just trying to build community with each other. And I think that's the thing. I think we have to kind of move from, we've been talking about like the white church. I think we have to move down to churches, right, to the local level, because the only way that this happens is if there's accountability. And the only way white churches are accountable is if they're in relationship with Black folks, right? And because otherwise we just kind of float free, right, in our own self-interest, and pretend like everything's fine. And so, the one example they gave me is that they had just formed this relationship when Dylan Roof walked into Mother Emanuel AME and gunned down 9 African-American worshipers or people attending Bible study. And the Scott Dickinson, the pastor of the white church, told me, he said, look, I'd like to think that in any circumstances, we would know that we needed to do something, we needed to say something, we needed to be in solidarity with our African-American brothers and sisters around such a horrific event. And we know we need to show up, right, for our neighbors around the corner and tell them we're with them. We got their backs. And, he said, but I can't honestly tell you that I know for certain we would have done that had we not already begun this journey because it's just easy, right? Trayvon Martin doesn't affect us. Charlottesville doesn't affect us. It's just easy. But I think the thing that stuck with me is he said, but we know those people, right? And we knew they were angry, they were hurting, they were, just in despair in many ways. And we know what to do. Well, there's people we love who are hurting, right? And it becomes a more organic response rather than some principle or duty that's always kind of thin gruel, I think, for leading to action. So I would say that like the work has to be done at the local community and in relationships, right? So I mean, certainly white churches have their own work to do, and I do think things like, churches that like I preached this past weekend at Boston Avenue United Methodist Church in Tulsa. Now that is a big, tall steeple, prominent white Methodist church that used to be a part of the Methodist Episcopal Church South, right? So they were on the Confederate divide of the Methodists. That church is leading 100 days of reflection on their members leading up to the 100th anniversary of the Tulsa Race Massacre. So, that kind of work, right, where you're going to commit the entire season of Lent and beyond to reflecting and coming to terms with their role. And it's not just kind of up here. I mean, it's like, what was our role? And in fact, I preached back to them the sermon, a part of the sermon that the Methodist bishop preached in their pulpit the Sunday after the Tulsa Race Massacre, where that bishop blamed the violence on the African American community, and he said, and the main message he had was to say, he said, we need to tell the Negroes in our community, this is his language, that there never has been and there never will be social equality between the races. It is divinely mandated, right? That was his message from the pulpit in the wake of 300 people being massacred by their white Christian neighbors over a period of 2 days in Tulsa. That was the word of God to the people of God, from that pulpit. And to go from there, and that church now today is leading this very different self, kind of examination. I think those kinds of things, and they're doing it, in conversation with other African American churches in the community, including one that was burned to the ground, as part of that massacre 100 years ago. I think it's that kind of work. And again, it's not rocket science really, but it's not easy either. It's just a matter of commitment and being committed to trying to get to know people and to be in relationship with people.
So, wow. I mean, what a powerful example, right? I mean, to go back into the history and to have that kind of in your face proof, and evidence. And so I appreciate that. And my question following through, I see that work as necessary and not sufficient, right? In a lot of ways. And some of the challenge I see, again, because I think there's been examples like that throughout our own history, right? The Quakers had some good moments, right? We had, Thurman had, an interracial church well before. I mean, a lot of those examples. And what I haven't seen in the reflection, even in the academic theology that I've been reading, right? Like what I haven't seen in the reflection is an encounter with Christ, an encounter with the Christ who blesses and even shows up in our worship when our worship is broken, right? When our relationships are broken, when we are out of communion with other people. And so, the church as an institution, and we as a people, certainly good white liberal Christians, have started to come around to this idea that, wow, our social institutions, our actions, our relationships need to be changed because, wow, look at this 400 years or more of history that has really warped us to get us where we are. I haven't heard the call for, our theology grew up in the same water, has been swimming in that same water as our institutions. And so we need to look and understand and change our Christology, that we believe in a Christ who is at our beck and call, or at least will show up even when we've just done all these things or said all these things or act in this way, or, and so I'm curious, where and how, and that's part of my work right now, where I am trying to unearth a Eucharistic theology, as you said, right? Like bringing it in from the streets, bringing it in from what Niebuhr was talking about, right? Like bringing it in from the womanist traditions, bringing it in from Black Lives Matter, bringing it in from Cape Coast Castle on the Ghanaian coast, so that we take seriously and submit. You said this too, I think, be under the authority of, be in relationship with Black authority, right? Be accountable. I think that was the word you used, be accountable to that. And so I support the relational piece, the on the ground piece. How do you see the foundational theological shift that is necessary?
No, I'm glad you brought that up. I mean, I think we've done next to zero theological reform, in any serious way, on this front. And you would think of, my gosh, like, so, right. If you look at this history squarely, if you really take it to heart and you sit with it, you have to ask, okay, so what was so screwed up about our theology, right, that it could so comfortably sit with these commitments to white supremacy and not challenge it? What got screened out? What got and how does it? Yeah, everything from kind of throw all the systematic theology words at you, right? Soteriology, ecclesiology, theology, right? Liturgy, like it's all. I think there's generations of work to rethink those things, and I think without that, then what we'll have is a kind of weird dissonance between a kind of intellectual commitment, but using theological tools that were designed to protect white supremacy at the same time, right? And so discipleship, Christian formation, if we take any of that stuff seriously, right, we think about that as, back to Baldwin's words, as we think, the point of kind of Christian formation and discipleship is to shape one's worldview and personality, right? To be more in line with what God is doing in the world. And we have so utterly failed at that, right? There's no way to read our history and not see how utterly we failed, and to pretend that we can kind of hold on to the same theology, the same view of Jesus, the same understanding of salvation, that wrought that stuff, I think is really infantile, and our really immature thinking. So yeah, I think that's exactly. I think there's, we need a whole generation, right, to rise up and say, you know what, we're going to rethink it from the ground up. We're going to take what we think is usable. We're going to jettison everything we think was complicit, and we're going to try to do something new with this new moment in the world. But when you think about how, again, I was using the word lost, how lost white Christianity, and again, I should say too, to your point earlier, I think everybody loves to pick on my people, the white evangelicals, there's plenty of room for that. But what was astonishing to me in the book is that when I looked at the contemporary public opinion data, right, I used this racism index, and it was kind of a composite. I won't go into the details here, but it was basically a composite measure of attitudes about systemic racism in the country. And I scored it like 0 to 10. And with 10 being kind of denying systemic racism, holding the most racist attitudes up at 10, down to 0, white evangelicals scored 8 out of 10 on that index, which maybe not surprise anybody, but white mainline Protestants scored 7, right? And white Catholics scored 7, right? Where do whites who are not Christian score? 4, right?
Right.
And so if you think about this, like, that is a damning indictment of that. If you take your average white person and you add Christianity, they move up the racism index, right? They become more racist, more likely to deny the existence of systemic racism. That is an astonishing and appalling fact. And if that's true, certainly no more evidence. You put our history and those contemporary opinions together. There's never. It's a pretty airtight case for a pretty radical rethinking of our theology if we don't want to continue to form people who look like that.
Right.
Yeah, twice as likely, right? Almost or close to, or close enough to twice as likely, right? You double your chances. Your book was actually recommended to me by the Reverend Dr. John Kinney at the Samuel DeWitt Proctor School of Theology, where I'm doing my doctoral work, right? Like in this idea, and it was a real slap in the face and an unfortunate and really damning buttress to some of the work that I had started doing, right? Of trying to unearth how do we answer these questions? How do we answer these theological, Christological, soteriological, all those, the words you were throwing out there, right? How do we answer those questions to this witness? And I think it's particularly, I mean, even more damning, and maybe we can just end at some point because all we're going to end up doing is violently agreeing with each other, right? Like, Dr. King's letter from a Birmingham jail, which I got taught in seminary, right? Like that was part of our curriculum, right? But we didn't seem to dig into the part where he says, I walked, and I'm paraphrasing, I walked by their churches and I wondered, what kind of God are they worshiping?
Yeah.
And it goes way back, and I really need to look up this quote, right? But even in our missiology class, right? Like you had indigenous leaders who on their knees being ready to be executed were told, well, you can convert to Christianity and live, or you can die right now. That's your choice. And he was asked, well, if I convert and then I get to go to heaven, will you guys be there? And of course. And he said, well, then I have absolutely no desire to convert, right? Like I would rather burn in whatever hell you call this than to be, eternally with you. And just, there's always been that critique and that recognition. And to see your book put the data together in such a way to really buttress the reality and to buttress the commentary that has been coming at the white church. And again, great that you point out, right? Mainline evangelical doesn't matter, right? And you even controlled for, I think it was age, geography, ethnicity,
partisanship.
Partisanship. Yeah. That's right. I mean, across the board. And
it doesn't matter.
Yeah, doesn't matter. Doesn't matter.
Yeah. It was funny. I was telling my wife as I'm looking at some of these things, we're looking at the way that Republicans legislatures across the country are now responding to using alleged voter fraud as reasons to change electoral politics in order to make it harder for black folks to vote. And we keep saying white Republicans are doing this. Republicans are doing this. I'm like, white folks are doing this. Because if the situation were flipped and somehow blacks had voted for Democrats en masse, for Republicans en masse, the white Democrats would be out there changing voting laws in the states that they controlled. Because somehow the culture, which is undergirded, like you said, Christianity, we like to take credit. Like, we like to take credit for this being a Judeo-Christian society, but then we don't like to take credit for being a Judeo-Christian society, right? Christianity has been at lockstep with the development of this country. Everything that this country has done, Christianity has been right there, drafting the language for what's being done. So when is it, taking ownership? White supremacy won't allow the ownership, to take ownership of any failings, because and this goes deeper into those theological terms when we talk about redemption, when we talk about repentance. Like, what does white Christianity really believe about redemption? Because it's like, if we believe in redemption, why are you so afraid of repentance? If you believe in if you believe in reconciliation, if you believe in salvation, if all of these things, why are we so afraid of repentance? If we believe in all of these things, and the Lord said that the first shall be last and the last shall be first, why is the white supremacist mind conditioned to be first? Does it really want to be last? What is this psychology that goes into these theological frameworks that thereby buttress this society that makes it impossible for white folks to look critically at the manifestations of its faith and say, is this what we want? Is this what we really intended? I don't, I'm not white, so I don't really, you know what I mean? All I do is speculate from the outside.
Yeah, one thing is I can think of on the partisanship piece. So I had a nonpartisan organization. So we're not kind of towing any party line. But one concern I have is that I think this goes for pastors who try not to be partisan, right, to kind of administer everyone. But I think in that attempt to be nonpartisan, there has been not enough calling out like white supremacy, right, in our midst, because it often wears a partisan label, and then pastors kind of go, oh, well, I can't touch that, right? But I would say this, that the one way of thinking about this is like, white supremacy and its kind of marriage and justification by white Christianity has never had an allegiance to one party, right? So but what it has done is it has taken historical opportunities to manifest itself. I mean, it's agnostic about being a Democrat or Republican, right? What we see is, I mean, the party of slavery, right, originally was the Democratic Party, right, and that was true up until the Civil Rights Acts. It was true like from the Civil War to the 1960s. White Christians were predominantly Democrats, right? But they were Democrats because the Democratic Party was the one supporting Jim Crow, right, and tearing down Reconstruction and setting up segregated schools and or enforcing segregated schools and segregated institutions across the board. So what happens in 1964, 1965? We get the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and all of a sudden the Democratic Party is the party associated with civil rights, right? So what happens? All those white Christians decamp, right? In a period of 15 years, white Christians abandoned the Democratic Party, and by the time we get Reagan in the early 1980s, have almost completely moved to the other party. Why? Because the Democratic Party became the party of civil rights, right? And that was an intolerable place to be. And I mean, telling that history plainly, is something I think we still don't do very well. But realizing that, look, partisanship has always been a tool, right? A means to an end. And the ultimate commitment has been, again, just, we can say white supremacy, and I think that's right. But I think for many white folks, to say it plainer, it's just been about defending a power structure where whites, are advantaged and that is built to benefit whites at the expense of others, right? From jobs to neighborhoods to zoning to all of that.
And you said it right there. When I was doing some work with a bishop in a diocese, his diocesan staff on extricating white supremacy, and we got to this point right here. That's what you said. This defending this power structure, and this is the when you talk about the stratification. When we talk about the stratification of the imago Dei that comes into play with white supremacy, right? The reason being, in my mind, is understanding that it's about owning power. Ownership of power. Who has the right to own power? And in white supremacy, whites have the right to own power, and white folks dole out power to those who they feel will wield it in accordance with white power's wishes. Which theologically is a very weird place to be when power belongs to God. And this is what, Bonhoeffer talks about when we talk about creation and fall. He talks about humanity sicut Deus and humanity thinking that it is God. It owns power. And so when you say it's a dangerous place to be for white folks, yeah, it's like, I tell folks all the time, it's like, it's not about Black Lives Matter for y'all. It's about White Lives Matter, because the way y'all are believing, walking this walk of faith, there ain't no way that you go into salvation. So it's about White Lives Matter. Like I was telling the bishop, the first victim of white supremacy was whiteness. The initial victim of white supremacy was the white self, because it took the white self out of right relationship with God. Set the white self amiss from the imago Dei. And so when we talk about self-interest from that standpoint, understanding, the white self has been hurt the most by this. But we can't in mainline spaces, we can't talk about this kind of stuff. That's what they tell me. I'm too polarizing. I can't make those kinds of claims. Maybe y'all can make those kinds of claims.
I mean, I think that I mean, you're laughing about this, but I mean, I think that that's right. I mean, it's got to be people who look like us, right? Who kind of carry that story, right? And just say, look, this is, again, it's about us and our kids and our, it's about our own health here, right? If we and about if being in right relationship with God isn't something we just pay lip service to. It's about that, right? And there's no hope of being in right relationship with God with a commitment to white lives being more valuable than others. And right underneath that, right, is a theological belief that God intends that to be the way the world is structured, right? But you've fundamentally warped, and put a block between yourself and God with that kind of fundamental commitment, right? What gets through the filter after that's up isn't much.
Well, yeah, wow. So I'm curious, right? I know with the book as powerful and amazing it really is. Highly recommend those of you who have not picked it up yet, right? Like, it seemed like the intention here really was that eye-opening, really was to pose that initial question of that, we can either inherit the faith of our fathers, right, or we can pass on something that is salvific to our children, right? But we can't do both, right? That really eye-opening and succeeded. And so, a lot of the data or at that kind of high level to show that it doesn't matter if you're Republican or Democrat or mainline or evangelical, wherever you are in the world. I'm curious if there was anything that didn't, from the data, that didn't make it into the book, maybe, or experiences that you've had speaking around and engaging with congregations around the country, probably around the world, right? If there was some hint of where a faithful next step was, is there a promising chemo drug that maybe you would recommend we put into like human trials somewhere, right? Like, any hint about a direction of research or a direction of maybe this might be a way to break in to that and break that cycle, so that the generations of work you mentioned probably need to be done can start being done.
Yeah. Well, I got to say, I think some of this is happening. I'm actually more hopeful now than I was when I wrapped the book. When I was, to give you a couple of examples, when I was, finishing up the book, I spent a few weeks in Richmond. I was doing some archive research, there in some of the historical archives and at the United Daughters of the Confederacy archives that are there in Richmond. I would, it was in the summer, and I would take a break and I would walk down Monument Avenue in Richmond, right? And at the time, that was just 2019, all these massive monuments to the Confederacy were there. There's 5 of them in these big traffic circles, stretching out a few miles west of Richmond. And as of last summer, 4 of the 5 of the statues of those monuments have been removed. Right, all in one summer. And the 5th one to Robert E. Lee is just tangled up in court proceedings. Not really a matter of if, but when that one's going to be removed. And in the meantime, I don't know if you saw it, but the January 2021 January cover of National Geographic magazine has the Robert E. Lee Memorial in Richmond on the cover because it's been transformed into this internationally known performance art space, right? And what happened is they took that monument, and all these artists went and like tagged the monument with Black Lives Matter sort of pictures and graffiti, and it's a beautiful photo of it's got the monument with, it's got a huge pedestal and Robert E. Lee mounted on his horse, and they've got George Floyd's face projected onto the pedestal and BLM across the horse, right? And with all this kind of, paintings and stuff kind of in the background. And it's calling on, and the reason it made the covers is just about like, here's this creative transformation, right? The courts held it up and they couldn't remove the monument, and artists took it into their own hands and said, you know what, we're just going to transform the space as it is. I could not have imagined that happening. When I walked down that avenue, just again, 2019, those monuments look the same as they did 100 years ago, right? When they were put up in the early 1900s. I mean, they were there. But one other tiny little note I'll give you on this, because I think it's a nice little arc, is First Baptist Church sits facing the Stonewall Jackson monument in the traffic circle. They intentionally moved their church there in the 1920s to be closer to that monument. They were originally downtown, but as did half a dozen other big prominent white churches, moved to be on these traffic circles facing these Confederate monuments. I mean, again, if ever there were testimony to white supremacy and Christianity, you move your freaking church right from downtown so that you can stare at these big monuments. So, you know, I mean, our idols, right? If you want to use the theological term, if we need a white supremacy idol, here's Baal. If we need Baal, a modern day Baal, there it is. But this First Baptist Church, when they were removing, the city was removing the Stonewall Jackson monument, the staff decided to ring the church bell, to celebrate the removal. And one reason why that's important is that same church existed before the Civil War, and then when they were in their downtown location, offered that bell to the Confederacy to be melted down for cannon to defend slavery, right? So this arc, right, of this church, this white Christian church that offered their church bell to kill people, right, to be an instrument of death, defending slavery. That same bell, so they didn't take the bell, it turns out they got to keep it. The Confederate Army didn't take it, even though it was offered. But so that same bell makes its way to ring itself in front of this, Confederate monument for nearly 100 years. And then that same bell gets rung in celebration of it being removed. Like, so I think there is slowly something happening, right? These are things I couldn't imagine. My home state of Mississippi, for the first time, actually, in January, for the first time, a flag rose since 1894. A flag rose over the Mississippi state capitol that did not include the Confederate battle flag, right? A magnolia flag. And that was something also happened in the summer of 2020, that the legislature decided to remove, finally, again, after more than 100 years, the Confederate battle flag from the state flag, and the Mississippi Baptist Convention endorsed the move, endorsed its removal, which is also something that had never happened. The Mississippi, that's the Southern Baptist Convention's state arm, right? That got and encouraged the governor to sign the bill and to have it removed. So, these symbols, aren't the work, but they are signs, I think, that some of the work, is being done. But I do think the real question back to you is that the real work will be, we take these symbols down, we make part of a Christian witness supporting their removal, but then will we take up dismantling the theology that justified their erection in the first place, right? That's the harder long-term work. And
because at the same time as the Baptists allowed the Confederate flag to come off of the Mississippi flag, the Southern Baptist Convention also rejected critical race theory.
Yeah.
So, here we go. Like, okay, you may have disagreements with critical race theory, scientifically speaking, but what about theologically speaking? Yeah. That wasn't, if you look at their statement wasn't, we reject the science of this or anything like that, but there are some theological things like we've been talking about, like you've been drawing out, that we need to address. So it's still, we'll agree for taking down the symbols, and we'll hold our theology intact. And it's like, again, the church always moves with the wills of society. The church has never been the leading edge.
Yeah.
The church hasn't led the society into the right. Desegregation came in the church after desegregation was public law. Like. Yeah.
I mean, that same year that the letter from Birmingham jail, right, was first published in the Christian Century. That's the first place it appeared in print, and Martin Luther King was on the editorial board at the Christian Century. So, white mainline Protestants, right, take some credit, right, take a bow. That same year, the Lovett School down in Atlanta, an Episcopal school, denied admission to Martin Luther King Jr.'s son on the basis of race. The same year.
Yeah. And so it's like, that's why I look at these things and these times, right? When it seems like we white Christianity, I always use the royal we, right? we never make it fully to repentance. We make it to just enough to keep the party going. Just enough so that we could hold on to this power thing a little longer. And so we'll do just enough recompense. We'll do just enough soul searching to say that we examined this. We'll be able to say this is what happened, and it'll be a satisfactory explanation. But what won't happen is we won't be saying en masse that what really happened is a faulty theology that led society down this rabbit hole. Because if we said that, then we would understand the need for doing the work that you've just been talking about, right? If we understood that the way that we got here to January Insurrection Day was because of a faulty theology that allowed white supremacy to metastasize to our society, such that the best thing for people to do in a democratic society was for them to take up arms and try to destroy their own capital.
Yeah. I mean, I'll put it this plainly too, that I think, we don't get slavery, segregation, Jim Crow, mass incarceration, disproportionate killing of African Americans by police with no great outcry, without white Christian complicity and participation in a worldview that turns a blind eye to all of that, and that constructs it, right? That constructs those conditions. And there I think still remains among, if white Christians would get serious about this. I mean, it's white Christians that have legitimized that worldview throughout the entire American project. And, in some ways, this is something that sounds simple and certainly is, I'm not holding out great hopes given our history for it happening, but it remains true that if white Christians would stop legitimizing white supremacy, it would change the country. Right. Yeah. The only thing standing in the way is white Christians continuing to give our assent and our support for that worldview.
Brother, that is why I do because I'm like, if the white church would just stop blessing and sanctioning white supremacy, if the white church would make it clear that this is the one time when we need to be preaching a divorce.
Wow. Yeah. It reminds me of the critique, and I don't remember which of the numerous Black authors have already said this, right, and have been saying it for hundreds of years, right? Like, the system isn't broken, right? The system is functioning exactly as it has been designed and has been maintained and been optimized to function. And until we consciously decide to change that, really stand up and take some action, it will be like that. But I really appreciate your hope, minor, even though it is, right, that there is the potential for change if we really stand up and claim that and want that. And your work has I think really very clearly pointed out the causality and the tie and the depth of what is needed and the depth of the reality that should be waking us up and will be one of the tools I know that I will use and have already used to buttress the theological work and to sound that alarm and that really clear call that we have to fundamentally change because we're not making disciples of Christ, right? We're not making apostles and preachers and prophets. We're we're just making disciples of an idolatrous white supremacy. And
Yeah.
So I certainly want to thank you for your time today. I want to thank you for your work and for the way that it's influenced me and my work going forward, and given Jabril and I grist for a lot of podcasts, for your willingness to come on board and really dig in even beyond the numbers and beyond the sociology into the depth of your own faith, your own experience, and into the theology that we all need to work on. So thank you.
Oh, thanks to you both. I'm honored to be here.
Yeah, brother. Thanks be to God. I appreciate you. The Lord bless and keep you in this work, that you may remain encouraged, that you may be in a state of courage constantly, that you may have the strength, that you may have the hope to strive valiantly, to fight the good fight for the sake of his kingdom, for the life of the world, that we indeed might become beloved community. I appreciate you taking this time so that we could share in the spirit together, that we could feast in the spirit together, have a little Eucharist. I know y'all Baptists don't have Eucharist too much, but it's always good to break bread with another brother. And so I give thanks that we could bring our offering to this virtual table together, and that we could lift it up unto him and hopefully turn it unto his people as something that is salvific, that we might be able to walk worthy of the calling to which we have been called, that we can find grace, that we can find favor, that we can live indeed in beloved community as he has called and ordained for us to live. So thank you, brother, for your work. The Lord bless you.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you for listening to Racial Heresy. Be sure to visit our website, racialheresy.com, to post your questions, comments, and feedback, and to share your own stories of life as a racial heretic. Want to hear more? You can find past episodes of Racial Heresy on iTunes and the Racial Heresy website. Want to hear even more? Invite Racial Heresy to speak at your conference, council, church, training, or event. Email us at ebonyandivory@racialheresy.com or visit our website for information on speaking engagements.